Coming up next on WNIN Lawmakers, we're joined by Representative Larry Bucshon to discuss what's happening in Congress this year. Welcome to WNIN Lawmakers. I'm John Gibson, WNIN FM News Manager. Our guest today is U.S. Representative Larry Bucshon. Before we check in with Representative Bucshon, though, here's a report from Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith on what happened in the Indiana General Assembly this past week.
A bill that reduces protections for the only group of wetlands that didn't lose protections 3 years ago due to state legislation was fast-tracked through the General Assembly and is headed for the governor's desk. Proponents say it's built on compromise, but wetlands experts and advocates say they were left out of the process. Republican senators say they want to make higher education more welcoming to conservative viewpoints, and legislation they approved this week could end tenure as we know it by requiring regular reviews of tenured faculty to determine whether they meet certain criteria related to intellectual diversity. And a bill unanimously approved by the Senate this week will give Hoosiers who've suffered property loss or damage due to disasters more money more easily from the State Disaster Relief Fund. A priority bill of the governor's, the measure is headed for the House. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
We're joined now by U.S. Representative Larry Bucshon. He represents Indiana's 8th District, which covers most of southwest and central and western parts of Indiana. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, John. Appreciate it.
Good to have you here.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with something that I'm sure is on a lot of folks' mind here. You decided not to seek another term in Congress. Can you tell us why you decided to not do it?
Well, when I got into politics, I was a surgeon before, right. And my intent was not to serve the rest of my working career in Congress, and I want to do something afterwards, and I made that clear when I ran the first time. And so this is my 7th term, John, right. And I really felt like for my family and I, this was the right time to step away from politics and, look for my next challenge. So yeah. I also firmly believe that, when you go to Washington, you should go for a period of time and then let somebody else have the opportunity to serve. And so, at the end of this year, it'll be 14 total years, and that's a good run, I think.
Yeah, very good. All right. We'll get back to that a little bit later. But right now, Let's talk a little bit about what's been happening in Congress. A busy week. How do you feel about the border deal that was hammered out by a bipartisan group of senators? It went down to defeat narrowly, even though it had many provisions that Republicans have been calling for. What was your take on that whole process?
Sure. Well, let me just say the House of Representatives, Republican majority, passed a border bill, H.R. 2, months ago.
Right.
And that wasn't even taken up by the Senate under the leadership of Chuck Schumer and the Democrat Party. So, House Republicans want to secure the border. The deal that was cut in the Senate doesn't make that happen. And part of the reason is it allows too much flexibility for the White House to basically waive the law if they say it's in the national interest. And anytime you have that in the law, it gives too much flexibility. Look, we need the border to be secure, but there's a lot of things that need to be done to make that happen. First of all, we need to discourage people from coming. That's the biggest issue, right? People should not come. And why are they coming? Well, because the current administration got rid of the stay in Mexico policy. They made it clear that if you come and you come into the border and claim asylum, you'll be released into the country because the courts are backlogged for years, sometimes even 5-6 years. So, right there, if you think that you're going to come here and you're going to be released into the country with a court date for 5 years from now, well, what's the chance of that happening? So, getting rid of the stay in Mexico policy, not cooperating with some of the countries in Central America. We had an agreement with them on this. The president rescinded that, is encouraging people to come. And let me just make this clear. This is not the border that it used to be. The border used to be primarily Mexican nationals coming to find work, sending money home, and most of those people didn't want to be citizens or stay in the country. They wanted to go back home when they could. Currently, we have people from over 160 countries coming across our border, all the way from Chinese nationals to people from Africa, people from the Middle East, including a lot of known terrorists who have been caught by our government, and some that haven't. And we know that for a fact. So this is a national security issue, John, not an immigration issue.
Right. Well, now, of course, the measure, as we said, went down to defeat. Did Donald Trump, did his comments on saying that this was not a bill that he preferred or he liked, did that have any effect on your vote or the process there at the end?
No, people that aren't in elected office don't have much effect on my vote. I mean, you know, the former president has the right to his opinion just like every other American, in my view. And so, you know, it didn't come up for a vote in the House. It failed in the Senate. But I don't honestly think that had any impact on most senators' votes. I mean, people think that it does, but when you're elected to office, you know, you're elected to represent the people that you represent. So I don't think so. I think the big part was, you know, they didn't even have to secure the border until more than 5,000 people a day were crossing the border, for example. And then the president had the ability to even waive that. So it was just not a strong enough piece of legislation that Republicans could support. President Trump really didn't have anything to do with it, in my view.
Yeah, okay. Well, and of course, aid for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, that seemed to be a stumbling block for some on this legislation. What are your take? What do you want to see, or what do you think about aid to those countries?
Yeah, well, there's a minority of people in Congress on both sides of the aisle that don't support aid to Ukraine and Israel, right? And, of course, Taiwan and some of our other allies. House Republicans, the vast majority of people support aid to the Ukraine. However, we need to get our own house in order. We need to do something at the southern border for national security if we're going to help the Ukrainians beat the Russians in their country. Let me make this clear. Vladimir Putin cannot be allowed to take over the Ukraine. It changes the world order by force. We cannot allow him to do that. And why is that important? Because there's NATO countries right next door. You know, there's Poland, other countries. He said he wants to reestablish the Eastern Bloc that it used to be. If he steps foot in a NATO country, then we're going to have U.S. boots on the ground. We don't want that. So we need to get this aid out there, but, you know, we also need to get our own house in order here. And that's what my constituents are telling me, and that's what the vast majority of Americans want.
So aid to those countries, as you see it, does it need to be tied to a border measure?
Well, ideally, yes, because otherwise we're not going to get any changes at the border because there's a disagreement between the administration's actions and, you know, what I'd say the vast majority, or clearly the majority of the American people believe should be happening. So, no, unless they're forced to make some changes, we're going to continue to have the border problem. And that's the way Washington works, you know. Not everybody gets what they want, but you have to have leverage points. And that's what we think should happen. So we'll see this week. Apparently, legislation's coming that could not have a border attached. Last week I voted for aid to Israel, for example, only to Israel, because I support our ally in the Middle East. But we'll see what happens.
All right, we will see as things develop.
Yeah.
Well, this past week, the House voted on impeaching Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas due to his failures on immigration. It was defeated by a narrow margin. You voted to impeach Mr. Mayorkas. Can you tell us why?
Well, first of all, you don't impeach people for policy differences, okay? So that's not what this is about. That's what I think a lot of the media out there on the national level want to portray this as a policy difference on immigration. That's absolutely not true. Secretary Mayorkas lied to Congress. He came and said the border was secure when we had record numbers coming across, knowingly lied to Congress, and also is not enforcing some of the laws as it relates to detaining people who don't have legitimate asylum claims. Look, it's more comprehensive than that. I'd encourage your viewers to read the actual report that came out of the House Homeland Security Committee and see why. But, you know, his name's on the door at the Department of Homeland Security. His job is to protect Americans, and he's not doing his job. He lied to Congress, which in and of itself is against the law. So, you know, we have to make the point to the administration that, look, if you're not going to follow the law that's been passed by Congress and you're going to lie to Congress, then you're going to be held accountable.
Now, impeachment is, as I understand it, is for high crimes and misdemeanors. We've
Yeah.
all heard that. Were there any high crimes or misdemeanors
Well, it's a crime.
alleged against Mayorkas?
Yeah, well, it's a crime to lie to Congress, and it's a crime for a elected official to knowingly ignore the law. So those are both crimes. And so in my view, in the view of House Republicans, there needs to be some accountability. And when you come to Congress multiple times and you say in front of Congress that the border is secure when the facts on the ground say that that isn't true. And look, that's not my opinion. Talk to border security. I've been to the border 2 times in the last 4 years, and both times they'll tell you directly, we can't enforce the law. The administration since 2020 won't allow us to enforce the law. We have to release people into the country by the thousands, really by the millions. And so, yeah, I mean, I think he's committed the crime of lying to Congress and also knowingly ignoring U.S. law. And he's the secretary.
Is there any concern that this impeachment sets a new precedent, that perhaps impeachment will become even more common, that, regardless, whoever's in the White House, if it's different than Congress, there's bound to be an impeachment? Is that a concern?
Of course it is. I mean, that's why it's not a policy dispute. You don't impeach people when you disagree with them politically, right? Well, I mean, that it would result in cabinet secretaries being brought up for impeachment all the time.
Right.
You have to violate the law. Secretary Mayorkas came to Congress, lied openly to Congress, in our view, and also isn't enforcing the current laws that are on the books. So I hope it doesn't set a precedent politically. Right. Could it? Possibly, but I doubt it.
All right, well, let's move on to the continuing resolution that prevents the federal government from shutting down, at least parts of the government shutting down. It expires again in March. What are some of the issues that are preventing an actual spending bill from passing Congress?
Well, it's partisan differences on what money should be spent on and how much. Look, this process should have been completed by the end of September last year for the 2024 fiscal year. I would have supported that. But the reality is that honestly, House Republicans, some of my colleagues amongst House Republicans just wouldn't vote for our own legislation. We brought things through the committee under the normal process, and they wouldn't vote for it. And we're in a slim majority. And of course, there's social issue priorities in these bills, partisan priorities, and of course, Democrats aren't going to vote for that. And so, we had no choice but to do a continuing resolution a couple of times here now, because the government should not shut down. It doesn't work for the American people, and it doesn't give you a political advantage. And I think both Speaker McCarthy and Speaker Johnson know that. So it's just a difference of how you spend your money and on what and how much. And look, I've been in Congress for 14 years, and I don't think we've ever funded the government in the way that we're supposed to. And that needs to change. There needs to be broad budget reform. And I've been for that since I've been in Congress. We just haven't made it happen.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the continuing resolution process. Basically, how does it work? And as you say, it looks like something that we've done several times now. It looks like, is this going to have to continue for a while?
Well, I hope not. So what happens is last year's budget ultimately was passed with a couple of big, large bills that actually funded the government. Right? A continuing resolution, when you come to the end of that funding, continuing resolution continues the funding as it was in the previous fiscal year.
At that level,
At that level, and for the same things. Right? So you can't start programs, you can't end programs, you can't increase or decrease the amount of money. But it doesn't allow the government to shut down because you continue to fund it. It's not the way to do business, especially for the military, right? Every year projects change and things can be done. And that impacts Indiana. We've got a lot of DOD presence in our state, including Crane Naval Surface Warfare Center here in southwest Indiana. So that's how the process works. I'm hopeful that now we have agreed on a top line number, how much to spend, that we'll be able to get the regular funding bills passed in the next couple of weeks.
You think that can happen in this this political year, this election year?
I'm hopeful. Yeah, because it won't be one bill at a time, right? There's 12 different bills to fund the government. It'll be a group of 4 bills at a time probably, and hopefully those will get through, and we won't have to do another continuing resolution. It's just not the way to run a trucking company, as they say, right? You can't keep doing things the same as you did the previous year. It's not right for the American people. And really, honestly, the Department of Defense really needs a new funding bill.
All right, well, let's move on to the House passing a bill that extends tax breaks that are set to expire. What can you tell us about that, and what are the chances that it will pass the Senate?
Well, it's bipartisan in the House, and that's because we extended the child tax credit, increased the amount so people with children can get a top line it's not a deduction in your income, it's actually, here's how much you owe, take this amount off of your taxes.
Right.
For people with children, because, it's a struggle for a lot of people in our country, and that helps. But it also extends what's called the Research and Development Tax Credit. And that's critical for innovation and research and development in the corporate sector in our country, including in Indiana. So I'm hopeful, it will pass over in the Senate. Now, look, there's going to be differences of opinion on both sides. On our side, a number of people believe that you shouldn't be giving these tax credits. They think it's artificially supporting the economy. And on the other side, they don't think the child tax credit was big enough. Right. So that's why you see a bipartisan vote to pass it. I voted for it, and I think most Americans think it's the right thing to do. We'll see.
Yeah, and I guess that's an example of compromise, something we don't hear a lot about, but obviously, under these circumstances, it requires compromise, right?
It does. It was an agreement between the House and Senate committees of jurisdiction, in the House, the Ways and Means Committee, on the deal to extend these tax credits for children and also for research and development.
We've talked before about bipartisan legislation and such, and perhaps there's sort of a, this impression that it's always at loggerheads and that it's always a partisan divide. Has there been much bipartisan legislation so far this session?
Yeah, a lot of things. These are the things that are what I'll say singles and doubles. They're not the big picture items, right?
Right.
They're reauthorizing programs and things like that both parties agree on. We pass those with what's called a suspension of the rules vote. What that means, in the House, normally it goes to a rules committee. They set the rules for debate on the House floor. When you bypass that, you need a 2/3 majority to pass these. Right. And they pass in a bipartisan way. So we do hundreds of these bills, literally. And there's some big ticket items. Coming out of Energy and Commerce, we passed a healthcare transparency bill on the House floor under this suspension of the rules. So bipartisan, we'll hope the Senate acts on it. There's a lot of bipartisan stuff happening. On big ticket things, it's tough.
Right.
But behind the scenes, we all want to accomplish some goals here, John.
Yes, indeed. Well, as we've mentioned, you decided not to run for another term this November. Does it take some political pressure off? Do you feel different not facing an election in November?
A little bit, but most of my votes weren't driven by that. A little bit, internally, but most of the time I didn't vote based on that. I voted based on what I thought was the best thing for my constituents, in my view. Now, not everybody agrees with that. All you have to do is look at my Facebook and you'll see that's true. But the reality is, no, I don't feel much differently. I think I still want to do what I think is the right thing for the people of the 8th District. Right. And I'm going to run through the tape through the end of this year. And look, it's been an honor and a privilege for me to do this. And I really appreciate my constituents giving me this opportunity.
What are your plans after Congress? Do you have any plans at this point?
I don't. I'm not retiring from work. I still have a daughter who's in college and goes to an out-of-state school, so everybody knows what that means, out-of-state tuition.
Yes.
And so I want to be able to continue to support my family with that, her particularly with college tuition, and that's another issue where it's gotten out of control, that most Americans are struggling to pay college tuition. I'm fortunate. My wife and I are fortunate. We're blessed. We know that. But I also are not the type of person to sit in a lounge chair and read a book. I want to stay active, and I'm going to be 62 this summer, and I think I got a long time ahead of me to stay active, hopefully in healthcare policy at the national level, but I really don't know.
Well, as you enter these final months of your congressional career, most likely, what are some of the biggest issues facing the federal government as you see it?
Well, the budget is top line. We have a budget deficit that's out of control, and most of that is what's called mandatory spending. It's mostly health care. And so that springboards into my area where health care costs need to be controlled. And that's not cutting programs or cutting things. We need more of a free market in healthcare. It's not a free market. It's price fixed. We have more consolidation. There's no competition. The state of Indiana is trying to address this, by the way. So I think budget is going to be the big thing this year that we really got to try to get a handle on. For me, healthcare costs, and we're working on those things.
You mentioned healthcare. Yes, I believe there was just a hearing the other day with some of the, I believe it was on the Senate side perhaps, where some of the pharmaceutical heads were in, and it was being pointed out how much lower pharmaceutical prices are in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So you think the best way to lower prices in the U.S. would be more of a free market approach?
That's our system, right? In these other countries, they have government-run health care, and they price fix things. The key thing to know about that, just in the pharmaceutical space, is that in other countries around the world, in many cases, about half the drugs that we can get on the market here are not available there because the government won't pay for them. So it limits access to care, in my view. So yeah, the first step is transparency. You, me, no one knows what this stuff costs and why, right? And so we passed a big transparency bill out of the House that does some of that, right? That forces the healthcare industry to disclose prices to the American people.
These are prices on like big procedures that you're having.
On everything, right? You should be able to go to the hospital just like you're going to an auto dealership and know what it's going to cost you, right? Or go into the grocery store and say, well, there's the price for this, right?
Right.
You go to a hospital, you have no idea. And the other thing is it depends on what kind of insurance coverage you have, if you have coverage at all. So, things cost different in different areas of the country. You could get a knee replacement somewhere and it could be $50,000, and you could go to the next state over and it's $25,000 because there's no transparency, there's no competition. That needs to change. Things need to be more uniform in price. The American people need to know what it costs and why. And when you have that, costs will come down.
Do you think that a bipartisan approach we will see some action on that this year?
I'm hopeful because we passed that bill on transparency out of the House. Whether the Senate will do the same, I don't know. There's differences of opinion over there, right, to get it through the U.S. Senate. But yeah, I think I've seen more momentum on health care in the last couple of years than I've seen in the decade prior to that, where people in Congress now understand more that the American people can't afford this. We can't afford health care costs. We don't want to have people not being able to get access to health care because of cost, and that's happening. And so we need to address it. I'm optimistic, yeah, that we'll do some things. I tell you where the action's really going to be. It's going to be in Indiana State House and in the state of Indiana,
right?
Because our health care costs are some of the highest in the country here. And the State House is trying to address that, and I think that's bipartisan. People know this has to be done. It can happen. We need more competition, more transparency in the system, and those things will get the cost down.
And we'll certainly be talking to state legislators more about that and
as you
other
should.
issues. Yes, indeed. Well, Congressman, are there anything else that you'd like to mention that perhaps we haven't covered yet?
No, again, I would just like to thank the people of the 8th Congressional District for voting me in office for 7 terms and having the confidence in me to represent them in Washington. It's been an honor. It's a privilege. I take it that way. And, I'm hopeful the next person that's elected, it'll be up to the people, will take it that way, and I think they will. But it's been an opportunity of a lifetime for me, to represent the people in Washington. It's humbling. I'm still humbled by it, honestly. Every time I go to Washington and see the Capitol, it's just an amazing thing. Coming from a small town, dad's a coal miner, mom's a nurse, and you go all the way to Congress, it's the American way.
Yes, indeed. Do you plan to endorse anyone for your seat once the primary is passed?
Well, once the primary is passed, I'm going to support the Republican nominee. Prior to that, I generally don't think it's helpful to do a public endorsement of candidates. And I think we'll see there are some strong candidates. State Senator Mark Messmer is in the race and others. And Mark has a good record in the State House, so we'll see. But there's some other candidates in the race that people know.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Congressman Bucshon, thank you so much. We certainly appreciate you being with us this week.
Thanks, John.
I'm John Gibson of WNIN FM. Thanks for watching WNIN Lawmakers.